warmly welcome all of you to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival protected by Dettol, straight from the Darbar Hall of Tiggi Palace. It is our pleasure to present The Tale of the Horse, a history of India on horseback. Yashaswini Chandra in conversation with Mannu Pillai. Writer and historian Yashaswini Chandra's debut book, The Tale of the Horse, A History of India on Horseback, maps both the history of horses in India and their role in shaping Indian history. Informed by an impressive range of historical sources and spanning a vast swath of the subcontinent and Greater Asia, this flawless monograph presents a captivating account of how horses played a key role in influencing migration, economies, wars, literature, art and culture in these parts. Chandra has previously co-edited the book Right of the Line, The President's Bodyguard. In conversation with author and historian Mannu S. Pillai, she dives into the exhilarating rise of the age of the horse in India, which went into an agonized decline with the onset of colonial rule and mechanization. Yashaswini Chandra is the author of The Tale of the Horse, A History of India on Horseback, her debut book as a single author. She previously co-edited Right of the Line, The President's Bodyguard, a volume on the household cavalry of the Indian head of state. Mannu Pillai is the author of the critically acclaimed The Ivory Throne, Rebels, Sultans and the Courtesan, The Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin. Formerly Chief of Staff to Shashi Tharoor MP, he is a winner of the Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present The Tale of the Horse, a history of India on horseback. Yashaswini Chandra in conversation with Mannu Pillai. Over to you, Mannu.
I just wanted to say how grateful I am to the directors of JLF, William Dalrymple, Namita Gokhale, and Sanjoy Roy for inviting me, and how glad I am to be doing this with you, Mannu. And thank you for taking such an interest in my work. And let's get started.
Sure, it's a beautiful book. In fact, it's quite interesting that from page one itself, it's a charmingly written book as well.
Oh,
and it's quite interesting that it brought back an old memory of mine, reading through the book and the various themes you cover, where we generally think of the horse often as this very stately animal, right? You associate it with kings and warriors and that kind of a setting. But then you talk about various communities, various economies that were built around it. And it brought back this old story. I remember, growing up and, going to Kerala on holidays. And my grandmother would tell me a story about a carpenter. He was a very famous carpenter. And, he had a walking problem. But one day as a young man, he carved a beautiful flower for the Maharaja of Travancore and took it to court. And the story goes that the flower was so delicately made that when there was a breeze that came in through the window, the petals moved. And the Maharaja was so impressed, he decided he had to give the carpenter some kind of a present. Now, usually royal presents are coins, they're a length of silk, something like that. But in this case, the Maharaja decided to give him a horse. And he became known as the carpenter on horseback, which is a very interesting thing because as a craftsman, his caste position was low. So earlier on the road, if he were walking, he'd have to move away for the upper castes. But then having got the horse, his stature was not just physically uplifted, as his social stature also underwent a transformation. And, among the many stories that you cover in the book, this one stood out. But I'll begin with asking you one basic question, which is why the horse? How did this come up in your mind as an idea that you wanted to trace so much of Indian history through this fascinating sentient being, as you refer to it in the book?
Well, as you know, I ride. And horses have been a huge part of my life. I have a horse of my own, right? So to begin with, I have to say that the book came from a place of personal interest, personal involvement. I think that's how I got inspired to work on this subject. And I've discovered of late that I'm not unusual, that there are quite a few historians who work on the horse in the West mostly. And most of them are in fact women, right? And all of them, I think, also ride. They're all equestrians. Right? So in a way, it's a natural fit. Another scholar who works on the horse in India, Wendy Doniger, the great Wendy Doniger, she also used to ride. She's a horsewoman. She's been a horsewoman. And in fact, very often we exchange notes about that mutual passion of ours, right? And initially, when I started working on this book, my friends used to tease me and they used to laugh about it. And they used to say, yes, of course, you're writing a book on horses. What else can you write about? Right? But the more I got into it, the more I realized what a rich subject there is, what a tremendous history there is surrounding it, how ubiquitous it was, right? And so it has been hugely revealing and rewarding for me
Mhm.
to think critically about the horse and to think about all the associations that it has had with humans.
Yeah.
To borrow a couple of terms from Tabish Khair's wonderful review of my book, if they were the petroleum of the past, they were also man's best friend, right?
Yeah.
So, which is why in the book I presented the horse as a thread that connects, mythology, history, folklore, art, because the representations of the horse, the manifestations of of the horse, are right throughout Indian culture and society. And which is why I've attempted a total history,
Yeah.
right? So I
No,
think
it is in fact quite remarkable, because that's one of the things that stood out to me while I was reading it, which is that, as I mean, the word you used, ubiquitous, is actually quite accurate, because till less than 100 years ago, the horse was very much a part of everyday life on the streets, whereas now we perhaps think that it's some kind of a very esoteric concept to transform into a book. But you're right, it's been a part of human evolution itself for very many centuries and generations, and it's been an integral part of that. You mentioned mythology, so let's really begin there, because right from chapter 1 of your book, you essentially begin from mythology, move into the broader context of the horse in history, and then finally take Rajputana as a focus area, and look at the communities and the way local culture evolved around the horse. Now, the mythology is quite interesting, because whether it's the churning of the ocean story that you begin with, and how the horses appear, or the Ashwins in the story of the Pandavas, there is, all the way back in whenever these epics, etc., were composed, there is this fascination with the horse. And there's these strange details that you drop. There's a bit where you talk about how the horse is in fact mentioned more in the Rig Veda than the cow. And this would surprise a lot of people now, for example, because we're now so obsessed with the cow as this kind of religious animal, we forget that the horse also had its own relevance. What do you make of this fascination for the horse in the age of the epics?
um, I could have written a book entirely on the horse in Indian mythology, because there are so many ways in which the horse appears. What I wanted to do is begin with the most sort of prevalent, the best known myths of origin myths. And of course, the first one is the Samudra Manthan.
Yes.
And the whole concept of the horse being a gift from the god, a gift for the gods.
Yeah.
Right? That whole, and the horse chooses to be with the god rather than the asuras, right? So there is that elitist connotation. Here is an elite animal that has been gleaned by the gods with it has entailed a great deal of toil, and that is a myth that occurs in both the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. So I thought that is an obvious starting point. The other myth that is very prevalent, that that is repeated across in the Shalihotra corpus of literature, that has to do with the divine origins of the heavenly origins, rather, of the horse. It was a winged celestial being, Indra Tore, the sage Shalihotra, who was the fountainhead of horse knowledge in India. He tore off the wings, and that's how the horse ended up on earth, right? And what really struck me about these two myths is almost as if they anticipated the fact of the horse being imported through much of Indian history from Central Asia, the highlands, and from across the Arabian Sea, the sea trade in horses. So in a way, they were very evocative, and these are normative traditions, but across a range of folk traditions from all over India, the horse is evoked again and again. There's a lot of Islamic lore surrounding the horse. I'll come to that in a second. Then what you said about the Rig Veda, I wish I could take credit for having counted the number of references to cows and horses in the Rig Veda, but that was R.C. Sharma. And that also is very striking. We know about the Indo-Aryan association with the horse, but as you said, because the cow has continued to remain relevant,
Yeah.
whereas the horse is now as marginal as it was once central, I think we forget how important it once was.
Yeah. In fact, the sources that you even sometimes mention in passing, it's quite striking because there's this every now and then the Ashwa Shastra comes up, which feels like a very it sounds fascinating even to think of an Ashwa Shastra. I remember when I was doing my book on the Deccan Sultanates, there's this old 16th century manuscript called the Nujum al-Ulum, which has this whole section where they've got these pictures of horses of different colors, and they're basically trying to classify horses on the basis of color. So it's always been some kind of an almost magical obsession that people have. There's something very, awe-inspiring even in the realm of ideas, really. But moving to the trade itself, you mentioned that many of these horses came via the sea as well as by land from Central Asia, and the way you describe the actual transportation of the horses itself is very visual. The idea of thousands of horses being herded like this, 50 of them allocated to each sort of watcher to sort of hold in place and keep moving, etc., and how many of them die on the way. If you can just tell us a little bit about that whole process of transporting the horse itself and the kind of scale we're looking at, because it definitely wasn't easy, and it sounds like it was a Herculean task.
Yeah, I'll come to that in a second. But what I wanted to do with this book is I wanted, like I said, to write a total history surrounding the horse, covering the multiple levels of interactions between humans and horses, the trade by which horses were imported from Central Asia and the Middle East largely, fueled by cavalry warfare, is obviously a very important aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I wasn't very comfortable with taking a prosaic view by which the horse is viewed simply as a fighting machine or a trade commodity. I think that undermines that historical partnership between humans and horses, the bonds that formed around it. Obviously there were elements of violence as well,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that relationship, that element of relationship was quite important. Material history has taught us that even objects have a social life, that meanings and emotions are invested into them. In this case, we're talking about living, feeling beings. Yeah. So the experience of the horse, I talk about the experience of the horse, not just in terms of the horse being experienced, but also what the horse might have experienced.
Mm-hmm.
And which is why, to sort of just quote statistics and say between the late 16th century and the 17th century, 30,000 to 100,000 horses were imported to India, I don't think brings out the enormity of that trade, first of all, in terms of what it entailed, the journeys it entailed. And there are all these references to horses being injured, horses dying, emperors and kings paying for the ears and tails of horses. And how did that come about? Because obviously all these horses were sort of packed into ships, a whole lot of them. Then their food, their feed, the water for that entire journey had to be packed onto the same ship. That food at least was constantly deteriorating. So it's hardly surprising that the horses that finally made it to India, who made it to the peninsula, made it to South India, had received quite a battering. And I think, apart from, being sensitive in terms of the experience of the horse, I think there's also an important point to be made. Because suddenly all these references to, South Indians lacking horse sense, horses constantly dying, a high turnover rate, horses constantly needing to be imported, that suddenly starts to make sense why that was happening.
Yeah.
Right? And also, there was definitely an elitist preference for horses from the Middle East and Central Asia. And the fact that these horses arrived after these very expensive journeys means, it's like an imported car today. these would be very expensive horses because they were transported with such great difficulty. There was a great cost involved. So naturally, only elite classes could buy these horses, could purchase these horses.
Yeah.
So it's on both levels that I wanted to discuss. Try and give a sense of both the caravan journey and also the sea journey, so that it becomes very clear what the connotations were.
Yeah, in fact, there's this, it's almost moving the way you describe how the horses being shipped via sea. Obviously, if they died on the way, you couldn't keep the corpses in the boat. So they had to throw them overboard. And that's an image we don't really think of, right? Like when you think of sailors, etc., many of them died, and of course, they were buried at sea, as it were. But you never really think of the animals, and to think of the horse and literally the merchants cutting off the tail as proof for the buyer that, look, I definitely was transporting the number of horses I promised, but these many ended up dying. So you sort of cut off the tail and then throw that body overboard. There's something very moving about that in the way you describe it in the book. And you're right about, I mean, it's interesting, right? When you talk about the elites and the consumers of these horses who are actually bringing them in for either technology or as status symbols or whatever, the transporter or the merchant, that's the other element in the book, right? The merchants also become fairly important players in this trans-regional sort of political/economic exchange that's underway. So you have examples of Mahmud Gawan in the Deccan, Mir Jumla of Golconda, even Sher Shah Suri, the brief emperor's grandfather, apparently. I didn't know that. I had no idea his grandfather was a horse trader, and ancestors of the Rohillas, that even they were horse traders. It's so interesting that even the men who were taking this big risk, making sure that these animals were being brought here, as many of them, in a surviving condition as possible, they themselves also became, in many ways, major players on the political chessboard.
Yeah, about that tomb, I took my students, I was teaching at Ashoka University at the time, and I took them to Narnaul because it has a number of Sultanate and Mughal period monuments. And we had somebody from ASI taking us around. And suddenly we arrived in front of Ibrahim Khan's tomb. This is Sher Shah Suri's grandfather. And I was completely gobsmacked because I was like, that's the horse trader's tomb, right? And to me, it was like literally it embodied the extent to which a horse trader or his family could rise to. It stands to reason they were masters of a vast network, that extended from the horse breeding areas. They were used to catering to a very elite clientele. They were used to crossing various boundaries, regional boundaries. So they had tremendous clout. And it was important for me to try and chart. Obviously, the phenomena played out in diverse ways. So, although you've cited all these instances like Sher Shah Suri's grandfather, Ibrahim Khan, he was an Afghan horse trader. He was given land in Narnaul, which is where later Sher Shah Suri built this fantastic tomb for him. And he was able to raise a mercenary army. Then his son further enhanced the family status. Sher Shah Suri, of course, followed his own trajectory. He served bigger and bigger lords. He married into wealth. But clearly, he was able to make the most of his families into Afghan networks and obviously talent for adventuring. Then you talked about Afghan horse traders dominated the overland trade until the colonial period, until about the 19th century, right? Then in the case of the sea trade, it was dominated by Arabs, Iranians, and Central Asian Turks. You talked about Mahmud Gawan. Then that is another example. Here is an established elite, right? So the trade in horses with India, the trade by which horses were imported into India and textiles were exported out of India, was obviously lucrative enough for an aristocrat to become involved in it. And between his aristocratic credentials, between his, and the clout that he enjoyed as a merchant, he was obviously very attractive. And he went on to become the prime minister of the Bahmani Sultanate. Then in the case of Mir Jumla, rather than starting out as a horse trader, he attached himself to a horse trader. He was sort of the underling. He was a sidekick of a horse trader, of an Iranian horse trader. He started out the son of an impoverished oil merchant.
Hmm.
And so he was obviously looking to come to India as a land of opportunities, and the horse trade represented his ticket into India, right? So I mean, all these examples just go to show the extent to which the trade in horses had a social connotation,
Yeah.
and how it presented so many opportunities for all kinds of people. I
Yeah.
mean, I talk about Ali Ashkar,
Yes.
right?
Mirza Ismail's grandfather, Diwan of Mysore.
Yeah, yeah. And he capitalized on the colonial interest in horses,
Mm.
right? The British fascination for Arab horses, then the rise of colonial equestrian sports. At that point, the Indian princely set, anglicized Parsis, they all had a fascination with this sort of the racetracks, the polo and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So that is what Ali Ashkar catered to. So, it's just something that went on for a very, very long time. And it played out very differently. Like, this is the tomb of Ibrahim Khan. It's
Yeah.
extraordinary. It's
It
masterpiece
is.
of Sultanate architecture.
Yeah. It's practically kingly. That's the kind of
Yeah, but
impression it
that's what
makes. Yeah.
Sher Shah Suri was trying to do. He was trying to uplift his ancestry. He was very
Yes.
conscious that he didn't come from very good stock.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So he also built it in the vicinity of a local saint's dargah. So he was
Mm.
also endowing his family with a certain spiritual aura,
Yeah. In
right?
fact, even with Mahmud Gawan, what is interesting is that you refer to the networks that he used to obtain horses, and that's why he was valuable to the sultans, Bahmani sultans. What's interesting is that the same networks also served for as networks that were used for intellectual exchanges. So that's how he also connected with a lot of poets, a lot of intellectuals across boundaries and across oceans. And it's interesting that there's this overlap, right, between the horse trade, between this kind of poetic exchange, intellectual exchange, and so on. Now, moving on from these individuals and the traders who actually brought the horses here, another element that stands out in your book is how much the horse was essential to the construction of the self-image of several Indian communities. Some we know in a glamorized way. The Rajputs are a very good example of that. You associate a Rajput with the horse, and you make this point that in fact that association is not originally, the Rajputs didn't originally have that association. It was
Yeah.
built over time. And similarly, you also find that a lot of marginalized classes also ended up with associations with the horse. For example, the fact that horses became popular meant that mochis or leather workers had to start making saddles, which
Yeah.
sparked its own forward and backward economic linkages.
Yeah.
I didn't know Bill tribesmen were often involved in as horse grooms and so on. I was quite surprised to read that. So this whole idea of community formation with the horse as a very prominent motive, not just the Rajputs but also Marathas. If you can just take us through that a little bit.
Yeah, so I'm glad you started out with that wonderful story of the carpenter rising to stature on the back of a horse, because the last chapter of the book ends with instances of lower castes being prevented from adopting Rajput practices by which they could ride in their wedding processions on a horse. So the horse was zealously guarded as an elite symbol.
Yeah.
Right. And yes, we know that the Rajputs and the Marathas, the horse informed their rise as warrior elites. We know that they adopted aristocratic practices such as riding, hunting, horseback hunting, equestrian sports. In the case of the Marathas, we know that they began, they rose to prominence practicing these guerrilla tactics, Bargigiri, right? And they served the Bahmani Sultanate and thereafter Ahmednagar and Bijapur as both Bargirs, who had to be horsed by the state, and Siledars, who came along with their horses. From about the 18th century, they began to breed their own horses. So to that extent, and that breeding was combined with with farming practices. Yeah, so they to that extent they wanted to be independent. They wanted their own supply of horses, and they were breeding horses suited to the sort of warfare that they practiced, the sort of cavalry warfare that they practiced.
Yeah.
But what we forget is that an entire industry surrounded the horse, right? We forget that just as the horse was being ridden, the horse also needs a lot of looking after.
Yes.
And this is something, if you had that personal experience of horses, you cannot not be aware of it. You cannot not be aware of what a crucial role grooms play, how much of the hard slog is actually done by them. And exactly, so an entire subcaste of cobblers, the Zingar Mochi in Rajasthan, emerges, and then the the Bhils of southern Rajasthan, the Bhil tribal groups, are now differentiated from the Nayak Bhils of western Rajasthan, right? And what I was fascinated to discover is they are now known as Nayak Bhils. But initially, these desert bheels, some of them started to work for Rajput horse owners as saises or grooms, right? So they were called Nayaks, which was an honorific that and all the desert bheels as a community adopted. Right? But to that extent, this social their identity also formed around the horse. Then, for example, the Charan and the Bhat Bards of Rajasthan, they made the most of their mobility as nomadic classes. They made the most of their special status as bards and genealogists and mentors to Rajputs, and they began to trade in horses because it was lucrative. It, like we've been discussing, it gave you an automatic clout.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, there are all these legends of Charan goddesses endowing favored Rajput chiefs with horses and allowing them to, enabling them to establish their rule over different parts of Rajasthan, right? So, yeah, that's what I mean. There was a whole world surrounded horses. They were so central, and there were so many of them that social identities formed around them, not just elite identities, which is what we normally imagine, but also sort of lower status identities.
Now, I want to take a quick detour since we're speaking about identity and the importance of the horse in giving clout, in giving social clout, and even in some respects, sometimes ennobling classes and helping them negotiate that kind of power politics. It's interesting how horses were also given as gifts, right? You have these very interesting two instances that stood out for me. One was, of course, the Shah of Iran sending a horse to, I think it was to Akbar. And then Akbar sort of giving it to his son Danyal. And then after Danyal's death, the same very prized horse ends up with Raja Man Singh, who's a Rajput. And, he sort of values it more than a kingdom. That's what's sort of recorded, because that horse it's got so much meaning. And another one, which is linked to art. And that, it's interesting. And I think you mentioned it in passing somewhere about how when we look at miniatures, for example, from that period, we often see emperors, etc., on horses, these Rajput warriors on horses, but we don't necessarily pay attention to the horse itself. We see the horse as an appendage, not as one of the main key elements. But what's interesting is if you do, there's that one instance you give of Shah Jahan getting a horse from the Shah of Iran. It's a piebald, and then you find 2 or 3 other paintings where the same horse seemingly appears. The emperor appears on what seems to be the same horse. And that I thought was so fascinating, because it's not something I would have noticed. My focus would have gone to the king or to the central character, not to what he's sitting on.
Yeah, so I was talking to my friend Mehreen about this, and I was like, when I was making all these discoveries and making all these connections, and I was like, why has nobody looked at the horse? Because like, there's enough going on in these paintings. But yeah, so I mean, as I mentioned in the book, if you start looking in these court chronicles, if you start looking in these Mughal chronicles to references to horses, they dime a dozen and they're banal.
Yeah.
Like so and so paid court, paid homage. He was given 100 horses. So you don't really get a sense of any special meaning or any special connection. You do. I mean, there are, of course, some instances like the one that you cited, which is a wonderful story. Shah Abbas was very fond of gifting Jahangir horses. I mean, Jahangir had all these wonderful allegorical paintings made, which are quite famous. This one of him giving Shah Abbas a big brotherly hug,
yes,
right? While he's very much the lord and the master of the universe. And they were, in fact, rivals for Kandahar, which at that point was a Mughal territory. And in the more cordial manifestation of the rivalry, sounds a little bit passive-aggressive to me, they were constantly trying to outgift each other.
Yeah.
So Jahangir was very fond of sending him exotic gifts. At one point, he gifted him with a zebra. He used to give him a lot of European objects. Whereas Shah Jahan, knowing full well the penchant for Arab Persian horses in Mughal courtly circles, would send one fantastic horse after the other. And the instance in which you cite, and there was obviously this was a long-standing tradition, because you had the Iranian emperor also giving Akbar this wonderful horse. And that horse Akbar gifted to Danial, and then Danial gifted it to, oh no, Danial died. So the horse sort of reverted to the royal stables, and then Jahangir gave it to Man Singh.
Yeah.
Right? And Man Singh was so thrilled. He said, Jahangir said he couldn't have been happier if I'd given him a kingdom.
Yeah.
So that just is a reflection of the emotive level at which horses were valued.
Yeah.
Right?
And you in fact mentioned how among the Mughals, I think the Turki horses were deemed relatively low class, whereas these Arab horses, the Persian horses, were deemed much more elite among the horses. And how, depending on what kind of horse you get, your status at court, your sort of position in the court hierarchy is also reflected in what kind of horse is sort of exchanged by the emperor via gift or whatever.
I think that the Mughals had a tremendous sentimental attachment to Central Asian horses, like they had to Central Asian fruit, because it sort of was a reminder of their Central Asian origins.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Turkey horse was definitely the rank and file of the Mughal army. The Arab horse was the high prestige horse. And these gifts of horses, in the case of Shah Jahan and Jahangir, in fact, this like constant stream of horses that were arriving from the Iranian court in the Mughal court, this exchange of gifts was papering over the political reality by which they were rivals, right? And so horses as gifts also had a lot of value. They helped, forge alliances, diplomatic relations. So that's another element, that's another aspect of, the history surrounding the horse. Then there's this painting, then you talked about the Persian piebald.
Yeah.
Right? And you find all these paintings, there are at least about a dozen of them, I think, where Shah Jahan is represented on the same horse.
Yeah.
The same distinctive looking horse. And we know there are lots of reference to a fascination. So Indians did love colorful horses. There's no doubt about it. They loved their piebalds and their skewballs and their blue horses, basically a gray that appeared blue Roan in very horsey terminology. And there are lots of references in the Shah Jahan Nama to Shah Jahan constantly receiving gifts of piebald horses. Yeah, and then you see again and again he's represented on a piebald horse. In the painting on the left by Payag, the famous court artist, he appears very much an elegant figure, glamorous figure. In the second image, he appears a divine king.
Yeah.
Right? He's hailed by cherubs who are sort of endowing him with a crown. One of them is beating the kettle drum, right? So it's worth wondering why he's represented on the same horse again and again. And you realize that it becomes a part of his deportment.
Yeah.
It becomes a part of his bearing as a king and even as a divine king. And, the fact of the matter is that it's very important for riders and horses to be matched. Riders are very particular about being attached to, feeling comfortable with certain horses. And it's not just something I know from personal experience. There are historical literary references. There's this Rajasthani poem that I've cited a number of times, in which it is explicitly said that the horses, the Rajput chiefs' horses, the riders and horses were well matched. Right? So you can imagine that it was a conscious choice on the part of Shah Jahan to be depicted on a certain horse, on a certain kind of horse. And I actually, based on the paintings, related to perhaps an actual present of a horse.
Yeah.
Eventually, of course, it becomes a stock image. But to think that, it's an incidental representation or it's a mindless representation of a horse is wrong. Again, there is no sense of how important they were.
Yeah. No, in some way, through art, what they're also communicating is that the horse is as distinct to belong in that painting as is the emperor. There's the horse is also being portrayed and it's not just the emperor on a typical sort of thing. But moving beyond emperors, the other big element in your book is the queens. It's these women, and you have this one bit, of course, on Baizabai and Fanny Parks, and how Fanny Parks, the traveler who came there, and they had this little exchange on whether it was better to ride English style or Western style, or the Indian style, or whether Maratha women sat astride as opposed to side saddle. And what's interesting is, there's, I don't know if you've read it, there's a viceroy's sister who wrote a diary. And in that, she also refers to the same Baizabai, and how Baizabai sent out a bunch of women to escort her to the palace. And these women came, of course, all on horses, these Maratha women. Except that on the way back, they had to stop in the middle. And it's a very fascinating, almost visual story, because apparently these women who are expert riders, in order to receive the viceroy's sister, they decked up. And the thing is, they were wearing these heavy nose rings, which they were not used to wearing when they generally rode, that they had to stop in the middle to get rid of this and then continue their procession, because they hadn't thought in advance and realized that wearing those heavy ones while you're riding like this would sort of, not work. So again, the relationship of women with horses is another major element in the book.
Yeah, well, I'm coming to this book as a horsewoman, so I'm not just going to be writing about kings, and what fantastic horsemen and polo players they were. But the references are quite thin. Thank God for Fanny Park and that rather extended piece about her experience of riding with Maratha horsewomen. And it was very comforting for me to know that no matter what Indian women were historically subjected to, they knew how to sit properly on a horse. So they never rode side saddle. They always sat astride on the horse.
Yeah.
There is this historical, we can imagine, and we know that Mughal women, drawing from that sort of horse-based nomadic culture, were all trained to ride as a matter of course.
Yeah.
And there are references to women who played polo, who practiced archery. Then Hamida Banu followed her husband into exile on horseback.
Pregnant. Yeah.
Pregnant, incredibly, incredibly nothing happened, and she managed to deliver Akbar successfully. And there's this historical painting actually, and we know that this Peter Mundy, this English traveler, he talked about how women of a better class rode horses, where women of lower classes rode oxen. Right? In both cases, astride.
Yeah.
And then there are all these descriptions by European travelers of processions, processions by queens. And this is the Dowager Queen, Akbar's mother. She's coming from Kandahar, and Akbar has arrived to receive her. And again, this image is relatable, is comparable to these descriptions, which say that their female servants used to follow on horseback, covered from head to toe. And you can see that in the detail that I've highlighted, right? Now, like I said, that reference, the Fanny Park's account of riding with Maratha women is quite explicit, because it becomes very clear that was conducted, all that riding was done within the women's quarters, right? And that a lot of the female servants were trained to handle horses. So you could imagine how, in spite of being secluded and having to practice parda, it became possible and it became expected, in fact, for women from elite households to learn how to ride, and to sometimes even be seen to ride out in public. And again, paintings, the art historical sources have been quite important for me. I've cited the example of the Chitrashala in the Taragarh Fort Palace in Bundi. There are these rather intriguing images to women riding horses, hunting on horseback, bearing arms. But then there are also the standard romantic images of languishing beauties, bathing beauties, languishing under the moonlight, waiting for their lover to come. And these are stock images. Like the one image that I've highlighted, this woman on a white stallion in a courtyard. It's a stock image where she's surrounded by these handmaidens. The same figure, in the same posture, the same composition appears again and again in the Bundi Kota schools of painting. But what they do indicate, especially if you compare them with references such as the Fanny Park one, is that women amongst themselves learned how to ride and they practiced equestrianism. The other instance from Jodhpur, you get a lot of paintings of women playing polo.
Yeah.
And there are two kinds of paintings. Either it's just a group, it's an all women group. So they play polo amongst themselves, or they're seen playing polo with the Maharaja. So obviously, the wives, the concubines, the daughters in the company of their husband or master or father, it was possible for them to practice equestrian sports.
Yeah. No, it's quite remarkable because even in the late 19th century, the Maharani of Baroda, Jamnabai, in one of her Marathi biographies that I was reading, it talks about in constructing her personality, this is one of the elements that's highlighted, that she used to go out riding in public and out in the open with her attendants, and it was a mark of personality. It was her persona was constructed around her ability to do that. Anyway, unfortunately, I think we're out of time now, so we'll have to leave it there. I encourage everybody to pick up a copy of the book and read it. It's a splendid book. And thank you, Yashaswini, for speaking for a whole 40 minutes about it. It's got about 300 pages, so there's plenty to read that's not been covered in the discussion.
Thank you, Yashaswini and Manu, for this informative session tracing the role of the majestic horse in the annals of Indian history. Thank you so much. We thank our celebration partner Diageo for their support, and we'd like to take the opportunity to thank all of you for being such a lovely audience. Do stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions we have specially curated for you. Please do remember to pick up your copy of the book from the Amazon online bookstore, and if you're in the mood for some retail therapy, please do check out our merchandise partner Earth Fables. If you enjoyed the sessions, do tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 and tag us at Jaipur LitFest. The festival is protected by Dettol. We do hope to see you in our other sessions.